Hello, everyone. This is Kevin from SIP. I feel like we are on a first name basis at this point, almost old friends. Welcome to Module 3 in the UDL Innovating for Access and Equity web module series. Module 3 will bring together the information that we've learned in Modules 1 and 2 and focus on mitigating barriers to access and equity through lesson design. As in previous webinars, you have access to the Padlet. You can access the resources at padlet.com/capital SIP underscore capital grant slash capital S, capital C, capital U, capital S, capital D. And we'll be focusing specifically on a few resources that you can access from the Padlet that will be relevant to the conversation that we will embark on now. So in Module 3, educators will identify the four components of UDL curriculum design. They will differentiate between content and methods standards for planning purposes. And they will recognize and address barriers in the planning and learning process. So here we go. Let's start with an analogy. If you're familiar with Copernicus, an astronomer, um, was the gentleman who discovered that it wasn't the planets that revolved around Earth, but it was actually the planets that revolved around the sun. The focus at the time before Copernicus was that Earth was the center of the universe. Similarly, in curriculum design, previously, the center of curriculum design, the focus was on the curriculum, the textbooks, the materials that we used to teach students. And all of the students had to access the curriculum materials in exactly the same way. And if you couldn't access the same way, then there was a level of disconnect between your educational outcomes as opposed to those who quote, were book smart, because books at the time, text, were the main portal through which curriculum and information were delivered. Things are changing, similar to now the focus being on the sun as the center of the universe and the planets revolving around the sun. Now, in curriculum design, it's the students that are the focus. The students are the light by which the curriculum revolves, so that there are multiple options based on how the students learn as opposed to how the curriculum allows for access. So I hope everyone sees the connection there. And in your processing guide, be sure to download the document so you can self-reflect and process the information. So the question is, make the connections between Copernicus, in that the planets revolve around the sun, and UDL lesson design, having a student focus as opposed to a curriculum focus. And the UDL lesson design, or it's commonly called UDL curriculum design, it just makes a little more sense that because we're talking about lesson development, lesson design, that we'll call it lesson design as opposed to curriculum design. So UDL provides a blueprint for creating instructional goals, assessments, methods, and materials that work for everyone. Not a single one-size-fits-all solution, but rather flexible approaches that can be customized and adjusted for individual needs. So you can see just in that statement, the focus is on the students, and it follows a very specific sequence. So beginning each lesson with a focus on creating accessible goals by identifying potential barriers within the lesson objectives that we create. Next, really specifically in this order, we then assign assessments that are directly related to what we're teaching. So what we're assessing is what we're teaching within the lesson objective that we've designed, and you'll find that there are sometimes a disconnect, that the assessments aren't valid and reliable because it's not assessing exactly what we're teaching within the lesson objective. From there, we move on to the pedagogy, or the methods that we will deliver the instruction, also identifying the potential barriers in the methods that we choose to employ. And then finally, what materials will students have access to so that they can understand the information in a more concrete way? Within the goals, the assessments, the methods, and materials, we're looking for flexibility in the process by which students attain their goals. So on your processing guide, you will see that there are 4 sections: the goal, the assessment, the methods, and the materials. And as we go through each of the components, be sure to refer back to this section to keep track of your thoughts. So we've put a graphic together to identify where we've come from Module 1 through Module 3. So beginning with identifying learner variability. So we've done the self-reflection. We've identified the variability or diversity of learners in our classrooms so that we can also identify potential barriers and then mitigate those barriers as we go through the lesson development process. So then we look at, what is the lesson goal? What goal do we want all students to work toward and eventually master? In the development of the learning goal, we also want to identify what those potential barriers are in the development of the lesson objective, the assignment of those assessments that are directly related back to that learning goal, and the potential barriers in the assessments. As we identify the potential barriers in the assessments, then we can also mitigate them. Same rule applies with the methods. The methods that we employ based on that learning goal, what are the potential barriers? How do we mitigate the barriers? How can we pre-teach? What are the prerequisite skills that students will need to master prior to the delivery of instruction? And then materials. What materials do we have available? And is it possible that there are potential barriers within the materials that students are accessing? All leading to the development of expert learners. So by providing multiple means or multiple options for students to reach their goals, they're understanding themselves as the educators are also understanding how students learn, to ensure that we're creating access and equity through our lesson design. And the question in your processing guide, why is this planning sequence important? So let's go a little deeper into the goals or lesson objectives. A couple points. UDL lessons start with a clear learning goal, and the learning goal also should be understood by the students in our class. They have to know what goal they're trying to reach in order to develop a plan for getting there. Learning goals are standards based. So we're going to talk about standards in one of the resources that is provided to you on the Padlet. Goals include verbs that foster multiple means of action and expression. So when we look at our lesson objectives, one of the main components is the verb. Every goal, every standard, every objective has a verb that students need to do something in order to understand whether or not they're moving forward to reaching that lesson objective. So we're going to talk about different types of goals, objectives, and standards, just so that we can become clear on exactly what the options are for providing students access. We also have to be able to separate the goal or the lesson obtainment from the means of achieving them, meaning that in most of our objectives, students can reach their goal in many different ways if provided the options, but they're all moving toward reaching that same goal. So when we think about the way we as adults approach the mastery of a goal, there could be many different ways based on the way that we learn that we reach the goal. So the process has to be separated from the product. So let's look at the 2 different types of standards or objectives. So the first is a content standard, and we have to be really clear or focused on the verb. So an example of a content standard would be explain the function of phrases and clauses in general and their function in specific sentences. So a content standard requires students to know something. but it also allows you to differentiate the lesson by providing a wide array of choices because the verb isn't specific in how students reach the goal. So we have to really look at those verbs and whether they are wide, like explain, you can explain something in many different ways, or specific to a method for obtaining the goal, which would be students have to write. So that verb of writing is very narrow. So back to content. So content standards require some students to know something. It allows us to differentiate the lesson by providing choices about how students will learn the material and how they will express their knowledge. So they express their knowledge, that's the verb component, and it's related directly back to the principle of action and expression. Students can watch videos, listen to lectures, work in groups, they can read books and articles. The possibilities are endless. Once they have the knowledge, they can express it in countless ways, which is different than a methods standard. So let's look at methods standards. An example of a method standard is students will write arguments to support claims in an analysis of substantive topics or texts using valid reasoning and relevant and sufficient evidence. So just by looking at the verb explains exactly the way in which students have to demonstrate their knowledge and skill. Students are required to do something in a defined way, not as much freedom as in content standards. Students must express their skill through written language. There is no choice with a method standard. The standard outlines a specific action or method that students have to do or perform. You can still consider the use of rubrics, exemplars, assistive technology, self-monitoring, mastery-oriented feedback, and student self-reflection. So let's look back at the principles, and we're going to focus specifically on representation and action and expression. So because the verb is very specific in a methods standard, it means that students have to express themselves in a very specific way. However, that does not mean that we also have to represent information in that same specific way. So we can still open up the various ways that we represent information. When we move over into the action and expression piece in the instructional cycle, that's where we become specific in how we allow students to demonstrate mastery. So the question becomes, what potential barriers might this pose based on your variability of learners, and how will you mitigate them? So on your processing guide, there's a space on page 2 for you to self-reflect on the differences between content standards and method standards. So you can write the definition in your own words. You can provide an example of each. You can write verbs that are specific to content standards and verbs that are specific to methods standards. Remember, verbs that are within content standards are broad, verbs that are within method standards are very specific. One is not better than the other. So in the fourth column, list the advantages and the limitations of content standards and method standards. Take a moment to do that. So we also wanted to give you some examples of verbs that open up the process by which students can demonstrate mastery. So the list on the screen now are verbs that don't define the way in which students will express their knowledge. So these are open verbs that would relate directly to content standards. If you see verbs like this in the standards that you're creating lesson objectives on, then the way that students show mastery, it can be in a multitude of ways. So let's look at an example. This is a first grade math standard. So students will tell and write time in hours and half hours using analog and digital clocks. So we have to be really clear on what we're teaching based on the lesson objective and what we want to assess. So the skill is understanding the concept of time. When we look at the verbs and whether or not the verbs are in sequence with the skill that we're trying to teach, what we find is that there may be a disconnect, or that the assessment that we'll get to in the next section, that the assessment is not construct relevant to the skill. So the verbs in this standard are tell and write. And in many cases, tell means oral output. Writing means written expression. When we're trying to assess the skill of understanding the concept of time, our oral output and written expression, the only way we could tell whether or not students have mastered the skill of understanding the concept of time. What are other ways that adults can understand whether or not students have mastered the skill? They can point, they can manipulate a model, they can have a choice put in front of them and choose which is the correct time. If we don't give them options and only allow for the telling and writing time, we may be assessing their ability in oral output and written expression, which is not the skill we're trying to get at. So we have to be able to analyze the standards and the lesson objectives that we're putting forth in front of students to ensure that there's construct relevancy in what we're assessing and what we're teaching. So let's look at identifying potential barriers. And as I said earlier, we're going to go through this process of identifying potential barriers, whether we're looking at the lesson objective, the assessments, the methods, and the materials. So in planning a UDL lesson, think about the learning barriers students in your classroom may encounter so you can brainstorm curricular solutions right away. Best case scenario, before any instruction has been delivered. One way to look at that is through a lens of academic barriers, physical sensory barriers, and social emotional barriers. And on your processing guide, there's a section where you can refer back to Module 1, where you listed the various identities of students in your classrooms. I think there were 10. We provided you space to refer back to those 10. We have space here for 8. So go ahead and write down those identities, those various identities, and also pick a subject area, because we're going to narrow it down just a little bit. So in the first column, list learner variability and identities in your class or caseload, and then choose a specific subject or activity that you'd like to focus on. In the second column, for each of those identities, what's a potential barrier to learning? And when you look at the barriers for learning, think also about what other identities or variabilities in our learners it would also address. So as we're connecting barriers to identities, you can also connect multiple barriers to multiple identities. And the same goes for solutions. You can connect the solutions that you identify to integrate into your class lesson, not just to that one identity, but also looking at the other identities that will also be solved by looking at the solutions through a pre-planning instructional lens. And then we've also provided a couple examples of barriers in the academic realm and then possible solutions. Like lack of background knowledge. Not every student is going to come with an understanding of the content that's being taught. So we have to look at pre-teaching the information that will help set the stage and calibrate the understanding prior to the lesson being taught. So we're going to talk about prerequisite skills as part of the learning process also. Same thing for physical considerations. Students who use wheelchairs, students with a hearing impairment, students with low vision, hearing, or other physical challenges, students who need to move. How are we going to pre-plan? And then also listing some possible solutions. This is not an exhaustive list by any means, but a place to kind of get started. So social emotional considerations also staying on task, disruptive, withdrawn. In many cases, the social emotional barriers and solutions will be part of the engagement principle. The first principle in the guidelines chart is where your social emotional or non-cognitive uh, issues are addressed. That's that limbic system that we were talking about in module 2. And then we've also created a lesson planning template. Now, it is not a requirement that you use this template by any means. This is just a template so we can document the process. And by the end of this module, or as you continue to practice, this process will become second nature. So on the last page of your processing guide, you'll see the front and the back of the lesson planning template. And we're going to go through each section just so you can kind of see how everything relates as part of a lesson planning framework. So let's start with the lesson objective. We've already gone through a little bit about the alignment of the lesson objective with the rest of the lesson design. So identify the standard or objectives or goals for the lessons. And you can use your template in your processing guide to take notes. And we're looking at the areas that are highlighted in yellow. So you're identifying the grade level or Common Core standard, the content area, the grade, how much time do you have to teach it, and then writing your lesson objective. So if you refer to a lesson objective, a standard, a goal that you've utilized in the past, you can write it here, and then also look for the potential barriers between the verb and the skill that you're trying to teach. Step 2, considerations for learner variability. So this is the subject of Module 1, learner variability, diversity. And we should have also been able to self-reflect on our implicit bias, privilege, potential barriers that the adults may bring to the learning environment. Based on the variability of learners, what barriers and solutions should be addressed? And there's a space for that in your lesson planning template. Considerations for learning variability. In this space, as you type, will expand because we know we have more learner variability in our classrooms than this space will allow. And then we're going to move to assessment. So you'll notice, let me go back. You'll notice that right after the learner variability, now we've implemented or put into context the principles of UDL, the engagement, the representation, and action expression that will link back to that variability of learners so that we can mitigate those potential barriers based on the identities, the intersectionality of those identities that students bring to the learning environment. Now we're going to look at assessment. How will students be assessed to determine their level of mastery of the standard? And again, what are the potential barriers that are inherent in the assessments? And many of the participants in our UDL trainings go back to, state testing. And state testing doesn't allow for us to implement accommodations for assessment. We have to be really clear on what is available for students based on the accommodations guide for the SBAC and what we're utilizing or employing to mitigate the barriers in assessment in our classroom instruction. So there's a space on the lesson planning template for that consideration. So just a couple points about assessment. They're ongoing and focused on learner progress. So we are formatively assessing students and we're adjusting as we go. The formative assessment is critical to this process because in many cases, the summative assessments, it happens too late. So formative assessments are ongoing and focused on the learner progress. Now, let's also look at this through a different lens. In many cases, we're as adults putting ourselves in this context saying we want to learn what the students know and are able to do. We also have to put that back on the students, and are they provided opportunities to understand themselves through the formative and summative assessment process to self-reflect on what works for them and what doesn't work for them. Assessments measure both product and process. So the product is the lesson objective, and the process is the way in which students will reach that that goal. So the process can vary. The product can also vary, but remember, the product is based on the content standard as opposed to whether or not we are utilizing a method standard. So the product could be very broad in students demonstrating their understanding, or the product could be very narrow. Assessments are flexible, not fixed. And student assessments are construct relevant. We talked a little bit about construct relevancy in that, are we assessing the skill that's being taught? And there has to be a direct correlation between the two. Assessments actively inform and involve the learners. So again, this goes back to students learning about themselves, and this is the area that students learn to become expert learners. So on your lesson planning template, how will students be assessed to determine their level of mastery of the standard, and what are the potential barriers? Now remember, with the assessment, it directs directly back up into that goal that we've assigned for the lesson. And then there's a space to determine what formative assessments we'll use and what summative assessments we'll use. So let's look at methods. Which methods will be utilized to teach the lesson? What are the potential barriers? Methods are the instructional methods that include the decisions, the approaches, procedures, and routines that teachers use to accelerate or enhance learning. Because learners vary in the way they become and stay motivated to learn, that's your engagement. Comprehend information, that's your representation. And strategically approach tasks, that's your action and expression principle. The UDL framework emphasizes the need to employ many kinds of teaching methods. And in those teaching methods, we have to also identify what potential barriers based on the variability of learners are put in front of students so that there is a lack or lessening of access. Just some examples of often used methods. Also think about what prerequisite skills students would need to have in order to be successful with the methods that the educators employ. So if we're using cooperative learning strategies, do students know how to get into groups? What are the routines for students to get into their groups? And then do they have the skills and abilities to understand what it means to collaborate cooperatively? So in your lesson planning template, which methods will be utilized to teach that lesson? And the methods, again, directly relate back to the lesson objective. You're going to be hearing that same statement in your sleep tonight. In your lesson planning template, this is the actual implementation of the lesson. So we have our opening or anticipatory set students up for learning, gather the background information, calibrate the level of knowledge needed to jump into the actual lesson. What happens in terms of methods during the lesson? Teacher models new skills and knowledge. There's guided practice and independent practice. And then what does my closing look like? And the closing in many cases is that piece that allows the information to move from short-term memory into long-term memory. What are they going to remember from the information being taught? And then lastly, what materials do educators have available to them that will assist students in attaining the goal that was set? So step 5, what materials will be utilized to teach the lesson, and what are the potential barriers? So materials and technology, media, all align with the goal. And this next paragraph, I think, is particularly poignant for understanding the critical nature of appropriate materials. Fixed media of the past, especially print, shaped and even warped our understanding of what it meant to be an effective learner. Essentially, those people who could function well in a print-based environment were favored. We even called them book smart. Those for whom print presented difficulties, individuals with dyslexia or English language learners, or those who were oriented more toward visual or auditory media, were shut out. Educational materials limited the goals of learning through contingencies and assumptions. And in that paragraph, I think it's pretty clear where inequities to learning and outcomes lie. So a few thoughts about materials. They engage learners in becoming proactive. Learners have many options in the post-print age. Just have to know what they are. And on your Padlet, there are a number of resources that are specific to each one of the principles. And materials, the last thought, knowledge being dispensed through one of two gatekeepers, the teacher or the textbook, are long gone. So just a couple examples of high-tech materials and low-tech materials. When we address universal design for learning, sometimes we go straight into the technology that's needed. In many cases, it's the low-tech technology and materials that are most effective for students. And on your lesson planning template, complete the materials portion of your lesson plan. And the materials portion comes last in the process because now we understand what the lesson will entail and what the students will need. Now, we've been through the entire curriculum design process. We know where we want students to be at the end of the lesson. Now we're going to look at those prerequisites that we referenced earlier. So consider the routines, academic content knowledge, behavioral, communication, and social emotional rules and expectations, self-regulation, perseverance. Front load with executive functioning skills such as planning, organizing, prioritization, and goal setting. And just in this statement, I want to make it clear that the principles are not siloed. They actually impact or interrelate with each other. So, for example, the more that students are engaged, the more ready they are to take the information in. So when we focus on the engagement principle, you will find that the other principles are also engaged. When we represent information that students understand, they're going to be more engaged. So keep in mind that as we move forward with understanding universal design for learning, what you're doing is putting what you already do into a context or framework that is universally designed. And then on the front page, it takes you back to the front page that before you implement that lesson, now that you know what the lesson entails, what do I need to teach in that anticipatory set? And then there's a space on the prerequisites, or addressing the prerequisites on your lesson planning sheet. So I referenced earlier that there's a couple documents that you may want to download from the Padlet. One of them is called the Essential Elements, the ELA, Math Common Core for students with moderate to severe disabilities. So one of the questions that we get are students who have significant cognitive disabilities that are many, many grade levels behind grade level standards. How do we align our instruction? And from a special ed perspective, how do we align our goals and objectives to grade level standards? Well, this is one of the concrete ways that helps educators understand instructional strategies and goal development that are based on 4 levels of students with significant cognitive disabilities. So we pulled one of the essential elements out. You'll notice that it's all highlighted in yellow. This is a national document, not specific to California. So if you're a special educator, a general educator, a paraeducator, that if you're utilizing the essential elements, when you come across a page that has highlighting, it means that this is a standard that's assessed on the California Alternate Assessment. So you know that it's a really, really important standard to focus on. But in this document, you will find all of the standards, K-12, English Language Arts and Math, and they're in grade spans. So on your Padlet, there's a column that is specific to the essential elements. All 6 grade spans are there. It's K5, 6-8, and 9-12. English Language Arts and Math, every standard. So what you'll find is 3 columns for each standard. The Common Core standard is written verbatim on the left. In the center is the essential element, or what we want students specifically to learn from that Common Core standard. And then on the right are 4 levels of student functioning. Mild at the top, level 4. Level 3 would be more moderate. Level 2 would be severe, significantly cognitive disabled, and level 1 is profound. So what you'll find is that essential element in the center column will be rewritten for each of those 4 levels, and then instructional examples or what that would look like in a classroom while still being aligned with that grade level standard, what that might look like. So it gives educators a starting point for developing lessons that could be accessible for students with significant cognitive disabilities. So that's just one of the resources that we put on the Padlet for your use. And I also want to reiterate that if we're looking to move students with cognitive disabilities, if it's possible that they move into a general education class for whatever reason with support, then this allows special educators and general educators to speak the same language around grade level standards that are being taught in the general ed class, and then the functioning level of the students that special educators are deeply aware of, how that would look within the context of a grade level standard. So that's there for your use. And then the other resource, if you're a preschool teacher, you're probably familiar with the Preschool Learning Foundations. What our project did was we color-coded all of the Preschool Learning Foundations in Volume 1 to match the Universal Design for Learning principles. So for example, this is a learning foundation in reading, the UDL version. It color codes each of the various foundations into the UDL colors. So representation, students will read familiar books. So that's input in. When encouraged by others, that's a social emotional connection. And then finally, the action and expression, students have to do something. And in the home language, talk about the books. So reading, they're going to read the book as representation. They're going to be encouraged by others. That's your engagement. And then they're going to demonstrate their knowledge by, in their home language, talking about the books. So you'll see that every foundation is color-coded in the exact same way. Information in, engagement, and information out, which is the instructional learning cycle. Which brings us to the end. It's been a pleasure. I have one more video, and I'm going to attempt to not fumble as I did in Module 2. But one of my favorite plays is Hamilton. And one of the statements is that it's not a moment in time, it's a movement. Same with equity and inclusion. Equity and inclusion is not a moment, it's a movement. So it has been a pleasure. I have learned a ton. I hope you have learned a little bit. It's been an honor to have been asked to do this, and I hope to meet everyone in person at some point. So I'm going to leave you with this final video, and I appreciate your attention throughout the 3 modules. Thank you.
So ladies and gentlemen, at TED, we talk a lot about leadership and how to make a movement. So let's watch a movement happen, start to finish, in under 3 minutes and dissect some lessons from it. First, of course, you know, a leader needs the guts to stand out and be ridiculed. But what he's doing is so easy to follow. So here's his first follower with a crucial role. He's going to show everyone else how to follow. Now notice that the leader embraces him as an equal. So now it's not about the leader anymore, it's about them, plural. Now there he is calling to his friends. Now if you notice that the first follower is actually an underestimated form of leadership in itself. It takes guts to stand out like that. The first follower is what transforms a lone nut into a leader. And here comes a second follower. Now it's not a lone nut, it's not 2 nuts. 3 is a crowd, and the crowd is news. So a movement must be public. It's important to show not just the leader, but the followers, because you find that new followers emulate the followers, not the leader. Now here come 2 more people, and immediately after, 3 more people. Now we've got momentum. This is the tipping point. Now we've got a movement. So Notice that as more people join in, it's less risky. So those that were sitting on the fence before now have no reason not to. They won't stand out, they won't be ridiculed, but they will be part of the in crowd if they hurry. So over the next minute, you'll see all of the those that prefer to stick with the crowd, because eventually they would be ridiculed for not joining in. And that's how you make a movement. But let's recap some lessons from this. So first, if you are the type, like the shirtless dancing guy, that is standing alone, remember the importance of nurturing your first few followers as equals. So it's clearly about the movement, not you. Okay, but we might have missed the real lesson here. The biggest lesson, if you noticed, did you catch it? Is that leadership is over-glorified. That yes, it was the shirtless guy was first, and he'll get all the credit, but it was really the first follower that transformed the lone nut into a leader. So as we're told that we should all be leaders, that would be really ineffective. If you really care about starting a movement, have the courage to follow and show others how to follow. And when you find a lone nut doing something great, have the guts to be the first one to stand up and join in. And what a perfect place to do that, TED. Thanks.
So be that lone nut, be part of the in crowd, and join us in the universal design for learning revolution. Thank you.